A Teacher's History of the United States, Episode 1, The New World? Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States and the inaugural episode in the podcast. Pretty exciting stuff. And I'd like to begin this episode by just pointing out that whenever I teach my first lesson in my U.S. history course in early September every year, inevitably, students expect for me to begin with Christopher Columbus and his sailing around the ocean blue in, well, we all know the year, 1492. And look, for the most part, that assumption, when taken at first glance, would make total sense. School books, TV, really every way we access American history reinforces this idea that Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, that he's the forefather of our nation, and he's someone to be adored, admired, and even celebrated. I mean, we have a national holiday for the guy. And to be honest with you, I can't blame anyone for that expectation. That's certainly how I viewed Christopher Columbus and how I viewed early American history when I was younger. But the more I learned about American history, the more I realized just how little I knew. So what if I were to tell you Christopher Columbus definitely was not the first European to land in North America, and he may have been second, or third, or fourth, or maybe even 1,000 years later than others? Let that sink in. 1,000 years after other Europeans. Maybe. Today we're going to be discussing some of these other potential early explorers. Not just Columbus, but all the people that could have or did come before Christopher Columbus. Then we're going to briefly discuss the Native Americans in the pre-Columbian period of American history, which, basically just means before Christopher Columbus. I mean, the guy even has his own historical period named after him. Then we're going to talk about the situation in Europe that led to the Columbian expedition and all the subsequent expeditions to the New World. So, one thing that needs to be debunked right off the bat is this idea that the New World was, quote-unquote, discovered, that the New World was found, or that the New World even needed to be found. It was populated by millions of people in the 15th century. Let me repeat that. North and South America was populated by millions of people in the 1400s. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians often debate who the first people were that arrived in the Americas, how they lived, and when they arrived. Many scholars today are in agreement, though, that the first people who came to North America came through a land bridge called Beringia about 20,000 years ago, located where the Bering Strait is today, in between Alaska and Russia. Although evidence of this theory, unfortunately, like many things, is a bit lacking. But, in theory, because of the frigid temperatures at the time, the glaciers sucked up the water, leaving a narrow, temporary land bridge to the New World. Now, accepting this as fact, whether we can ever definitively prove it or not, and my guess is that we won't ever be able to, one way or the other, isn't really what I was always most intrigued by when examining early exploration to the Americas. I've always been fascinated by who exactly was the first group or person to travel to the Americas, not by foot over the Bering Strait, but by water. I want to preface this discussion by pointing out that, like I said, no one really knows for sure who the first people were to do it, but there's a lot of evidence out there that would suggest it might be someone maybe you weren't expecting, and that you probably did not learn about in your high school history class, or maybe even your college history class. There's evidence available that shows that the Phoenicians and Egyptians likely were able to sail to Ireland and England, and even being able to sail around Africa as long as 2,500 years ago. Some believe that the Phoenicians were the first to land in the New World around the same time. There are other curiosities, like potential Roman artifacts found in South America. Yes, that's right, ancient Rome. Over 1,000 years prior to Columbus. There are Irish legends written in the 9th or 10th century about St. Brendan the Navigator reaching the New World in the 5th century AD. So that begs the question, who were the first people to land in the Americas? Where does our history really begin? Of course, the answer is simple on the surface. The natives who had been living in the land for potentially 20,000 years were, of course, the first Americans. And look, we all know this is fact, not to be debated. Nonetheless, the intrigue and mystery about foreign exploration is a fascinating topic and one looking further into. Knowing that there are so many potential explorers reaching the Americas prior to Columbus, it begs the question, why is Christopher Columbus so celebrated in American history? Of course, the common response would be, well, Christopher Columbus's voyage is documented. It's factual. Not only that, but he had an immediate impact on the widespread settlement of the Western Hemisphere. Hooray, Christopher Columbus! An American hero. But we're going to pause with Columbus now for a few minutes because I would like to talk about other European exploration and what the situation was in America and in Europe prior to Columbus coming over. So we'll get back to Columbus. Let's table this for a little bit. So the lesson today will really begin with the first man to land in the New World that we have physical proof of. And that's a Viking named Leif Erikson. In 982, and if you're doing the math, yes, over 500 years before Christopher Columbus, Eric the Red, Leif's father, was banned from Iceland because of, a couple murders here and there. He founded Greenland, and then when he returned, he took colonists to settle Greenland. The first sighting of the Americas was likely in 986 AD by Bjarne Herolfsson. And I apologize to all the Herolfssons out there if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Around 1000, Leif returned to Greenland from Norway, where he was on a trip bringing Christian missionaries with him. Now, Ericsson made a few trips to the New World and settled an area known as Vinland. No one knows exactly where this Vinland was, probably somewhere in between New England and as far north as Newfoundland, but we know he was there for sure. In 1960, archaeologists discovered La Anse aux Meadows, and this was a Viking settlement probably settled around 1000 AD, like I mentioned, 500 years prior to Columbus landing in the Caribbean. Now, this area wasn't the Vinland settlement founded by Ericsson. It was most likely some type of stopping point between Greenland and the rest of North America that they were exploring. It was probably a temporary settlement, but nonetheless, this shows that the Vikings were in fact in North America and settled there. There's physical evidence of them landing there, although they likely abandoned the settlement after just a few years. They were there. This abandonment, of course, limits the impact of their discovery. Interestingly enough, though, the story of the Vikings landing in the New World is often not one that we acknowledge. Now, most U.S. history textbooks, if you look at chapter 1, they do cover the Vikings, but they do it so briefly. The credit given to the Vikings pales in comparison to Columbus and later explorers. It's almost like they have to bring up the Vikings before getting to Columbus, just because they have to do it. Before we get too much into exploration of the New World and its impact, though, it's important we take a look at the people who were living in the Americas during the 15th century. The Americas were home to a variety of different people, over a dozen different language families, and almost 150 different languages in North America alone. The natives in North America did not have a written language or domesticated animals, but they were skilled farmers, and they had extensive trade networks all throughout the interior. When we examine early American history, we will see that Native Americans are often portrayed as savages or uncivilized. Now, much of this, of course, is a justification for their eventual subjugation, but this idea was also common because they didn't have the technology that Western Europe had. While we've come to learn that this isn't an accurate depiction of Native Americans, it continued to be a common assumption among Europeans and white Americans throughout much of the history and settlement of the United States. We need to keep in mind that although the Native Americans did not have the same technology or written language, this certainly does not make them uncivilized or savage. The largest empire in the Americas, the Incan Empire, was based in Peru and developed between the 12th and 16th century. It stretched thousands of miles along the western coast of present-day South America. The Incan Empire was incredibly impressive, including a complex road system, a bureaucracy, schools. Heck, they even performed skull surgeries. The much older Mayan Empire, located in what is today central Mexico, had an even more sophisticated culture than the Incans, and it emerged probably around 800 AD. The Mayan civilization was incredibly advanced, including calendars, a written language, and an advanced trading network within their region of Central America. Over time, this region was dominated by the Aztec Empire, who were eventually wiped out by Hernando Cortez and the best military ally in world history, disease. They built Tenochtitlan on the site of present-day Mexico City, and this included impressive public buildings, schools, a military. Heck, they even had slavery, so they had clear social classes. In the north, native communities were primarily based on hunting, fishing, and farming. On the west coast of North America, most natives were fishermen or gatherers, with the most developed regions being in the southwest, where the Anasazi lived. In the Plains region, natives were primarily nomadic, hunting buffalo, and this is a group of natives we'll talk a lot more about when we get to the 19th century. In the east, the woodland Indians focused more on farming and were much more sedentary than others. In Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, there was a population of potentially 40,000 natives at its peak in 1280 AD, an incredible society that is extremely fascinating and one to look more into if you have the time. The idea that these natives were uncivilized or savage in some way isn't true based on the information we know about the natives during this time. Some of their empires and civilizations were fascinating, complex, bureaucratic, and quite advanced for their time. Hey listeners, I wanted to step out into the hallway just for a second to thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I hope you're enjoying it so far. If you have a moment, please leave a review wherever you access your podcast. It's a huge help to spread the word about A Teacher's History. If you'd like to raise your hand and reach out to me, or to Bill or Zach, please feel free to shoot me an email at chris@ateachershistory.com or find our Teacher's History of the United States podcast Facebook page or on Twitter with the handle @ateachershist. Now, let's get back to class. So let's transition next from pre-Columbian native societies to pre-Columbian Europe. As we think about this age of exploration, we have to ask ourselves, why was there such an explosion of European exploration to the Americas in the late 15th and 16th centuries? While some believe that the new wealth in Europe was leading to more trade, other historians contend that the bubonic plague of the 14th century really kept this from happening. There was a rise in monarchs in Europe during this time and advances in military technology. Western European countries dominated in military technology, and this will, of course, continue over time. And we see this domination quite clearly when the Europeans settle in the New World and use this same military advantage to control the native populations. And it gets to the point where this technology that the Europeans have to offer through trade is something that the natives, in a way, become very dependent upon. In addition to this, the governments of Western Europe developed complex bureaucracies that allowed rulers, merchants, and investors to manage ambitious expeditions and control land far away from their center of power. This allowed some countries to create large colonial empires all over the world. So I want to take just a moment and talk about one of these examples of traveling the world. In the year 1096, Pope Urban II began the Crusades in hopes of recovering Jerusalem from the Muslims. Now, overall, these were not very successful. They lasted a couple hundred years, with the last crusade in 1270 that was a total disaster. These even included a crusade by children Yes, children, in an attempt to convert the Muslims to Christianity. No one's positive what happened to these children. They likely shipwrecked in a storm or were eventually sold into slavery, but they definitely never returned to their homes. Not the best parenting going on in 13th century Europe. In the end, the Crusades are an embarrassing chapter in a very rich history of the Catholic Church and didn't accomplish their stated goals. And you might be thinking, Chris, why are we talking about the Crusades in an American history podcast? Well, the one big impact the Crusades had that play out in our narrative is that the Crusades educated Western Europeans on how to organize a successful expedition into foreign land. It showed Europeans also how profitable trade with foreign peoples can be and how interaction with new people can lead to increased wealth. But Europeans did not just experience this trade with the Middle East. In 1271, Marco Polo set off on a 3-year expedition with his uncles that brought him to China. He stayed at the Chinese Empire for 17 years, eventually returning to Europe in 1295, and then he published detailed accounts of his adventure, which is how we know all of this. By the turn of the 14th century, Venice and a number of other Italian city-states were making themselves wealthy by opening up trading colonies in the Middle East, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. Infamously, one of these Italian trading vessels is the vessel that brought the first strains of the bubonic plague from Crimea in 1346. The plague was historic in its destruction, wiping out about 1/3 of the European population. Western Europeans saw the success that Italy was having through this foreign trade, and they didn't want to miss out on the fun. Better late than never, right? So the Portuguese, led by Prince Henry the Navigator, began to explore further and further off the coast of Africa, and by 1488, the Portuguese had explored and mapped the entire African coastline, all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope in present-day South Africa. Sailing along this African coast, one benefit was it exposed the Portuguese to many different African communities. One hugely negative impact is that by sailing along the African coast, it exposed the Portuguese to many different African communities and will eventually involve them in the African slave trade. In 1498, Vasco da Gama brought a Portuguese fleet around Africa to India. Now look, to put this all into context, these trips were seen as incredible and groundbreaking for their time. Although we know evidence shows they likely, remember, weren't the first to explore in such ambitious ways. In 1494, Spain and Portugal agreed to the Treaty of Tordesillas, splitting the land west of Europe in the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Portugal. You know, ignoring the fact that there are already millions of people living there. And not only that, but not realizing how huge North and South America were, Portugal ended up getting screwed in the deal, only receiving a small eastern portion of present-day Brazil, which is the primary reason why Brazilians still speak Portuguese. When Columbus originally petitioned Portugal to finance his expedition west, the Portuguese weren't really interested because they didn't need Columbus. They were doing quite well for themselves, thank you very much. But it was in 1492 when Christopher Columbus did decide, yes, to sail the ocean blue. Christopher Columbus, likely born in Genoa, Italy, was a skilled mariner and respected explorer for his time. Now, he was originally dismissed not only by Portugal, but also by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. And then he asked a few other countries too, and they all said no. So he circled back to Spain and really begged them and really tried to convince them. And he did. They agreed to it. They figured out, what the hell, it's just 3 ships. One thing I'd like to point out here as we dive into the story of Christopher Columbus is to debunk this idea that he was some enlightened European proving to everyone that the world was not flat. Because pretty much everyone who was educated at this time knew the world was not flat. Washington Irving, in his 1828 biography of Columbus, included this anecdote that has stuck with American educators and American students for almost 200 years. Thanks for that, Washington Irving. More than anything, though, this seems to me just to be one of many attempts to raise Columbus to another level of intelligence and ingenuity compared to many of his contemporaries in the late 15th century. On Columbus's first voyage, he kept two records. One was an accurate record, and the second was the one he shared with his men. He did this to convince them that they had not traveled as far or for as long as they realized. Additionally, he did this to make sure he hid the true location of the eventual landing spot from future explorers. Now, it's not surprising that this guy Columbus kept inaccurate records to convince his men of something that wasn't true, because there are multiple reports of an attempted mutiny towards the end of his trip. He wasn't the most popular captain. And we can see why, because this is the same guy who offered a $500 reward to the first man who saw land. And then he retracted it when one of his men could see land, only to explain that he had in fact seen it the night before and not told anyone. How sneaky of him! While Columbus can be admired for many things, his daring and his landing in the Caribbean, his estimation of the side of the world was a colossal mistake. And really, I never want him to get away with that. He underestimated the size of the globe by between 20 and 30%. Now, I want to make sure I mention, he went over on 3 ships, in case you haven't heard of them: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And his first trip took him a little over a month, and his men were probably disgusting when they landed in the Caribbean and Hispaniola. They were filthy, likely having worn the same clothes the entire voyage. Believe it or not, there are multiple reports throughout the centuries after discovery of the New World in which the natives either mentioned the body odor from the Europeans directly or tried to teach them proper bathing techniques. How's that for civilized? Coupling this with the rats all over the ship, and you can see this wasn't your typical cruise to the Caribbean. In the end, Columbus will make 4 total voyages to the Americas, with many believing that he had never quite realized what he had discovered. Not realizing where he was when he landed in 1492, he named the native inhabitants Indios, because he thought he was in the East Indies, or India. No one's totally sure. When Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, he came into contact with the Arawak or Taino natives, and he said that he could, quote, "with 50 men, subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." As governor of Hispaniola, Columbus set a quota demanding the natives produce a required amount of gold. If the natives did not reach this quota, Columbus and his men would sometimes cut off their hands, allowing them to bleed to death, and of course, in the process, sending a message to other natives. In 1500, as governor of Hispaniola, Columbus was arrested and brought back to Spain in chains for the cruel way he treated the natives, and for just being a terrible, awful governor. He was tried for these crimes and found not guilty, but this was the end of Columbus's fame. And that is where we will leave off today. Columbus has landed in the Caribbean, and very soon the rest of the world will know all about it, spurring numerous trips to this new continent. As you pack up your things, I want you to take a moment and just consider the impact of the settlement of the New World. With the exploration of Columbus, we will see the beginnings of European settlement in the New World that led to incredible new opportunities for not just the country involved, but also the individuals who flourished, whether it was through military exploits, personal achievement, or political genius. The unique thing about the beginnings of the history of the United States is that this land had already been populated by natives, and then, in just a few hundred years, 2 entire continents were colonized or settled by the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and of course, the English. And they were all competing for their own slice of this massive pie. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States.